Hi, my name is Dr. Kylie Soanes. I'm from the University of Melbourne and I'm excited to be presenting here at this forum today. Now, my role is to bring some of the broader scientific context to this wildlife road toll problem and work you through some of the solutions and what we know about how well they work. So big or small, busy or quiet, open or desert, tropical forest, roads are pretty much everywhere across the globe. And in the foreseeable future, they're only going to get more widespread. You only need to glance at this map of the road-free areas of Australia to get a sense of how widespread roads really are. And each of these roads comes with a host of environmental impacts, particularly on our wildlife. They can sever habitats, bringing noise, disturbance, and deadly vehicles. So roadkill is probably the most obvious impact, and there are three main perspectives. First, we can look at it from the issue of wildlife conservation and those implications. Namely, if there's a lot of animals being killed above and beyond the natural mortality rate, what risk does this put on the population? And we know now that lots of species in lots of places, roadkill poses a really significant risk to the capacity of wildlife to persist in landscapes. So this graph here was a study of swamp wallabies, a notoriously common species, in peri-urban reserves around Sydney. And what they found was that under current conditions, this common species was going to decline over the next 100 years and had a good possibility of becoming extinct, in large part due to roadkill. And the authors found that reducing road mortality was going to be the most effective option to prevent this extinction. A decrease of only 20% was going to make all the difference. And keep in mind that for most species in Australia, we don't have good data. We don't know how many animals are dying on roads. So we can't really understand what kind of conservation impact we're having. There's also an animal welfare perspective, which I'm sure many of the other speakers will talk to today. So regardless of whether there's a risk to the broader population, we can all agree that getting maimed by a car is brutal, and watching galahs mourn their partners on the side of the road is, it's just heartbreaking every single time. And all around, it would be better if this problem wasn't happening. And finally, there's the human perspective. So roads are both a risk to people's safety, especially if you're hitting something large like a kangaroo or in this image, a moose. But there's also the public pressure to do something about the roadkill problem. This is a very visible problem, a problem that people see every single day, whether they're paying attention or not. And the public cry for attention to this issue is probably why a lot of you are here today. Now, this lovely map shows you again that we're just part of a global problem here. These researchers were able to identify species and spaces across the globe where the wildlife populations were likely to go extinct within the next 50 years if the current rate of roadkill wasn't reduced. So this global roadkill problem is really affecting our ability to preserve biodiversity. Now, for many, an obvious solution to this would just be to focus our conservation attention away from roads, but that gets pretty complicated when you look at images like this. This is northeast Victoria, and as you can see, most of the woodland vegetation is roadsides. And for many species, and particularly many of our threatened species that depend on woodlands or remnant vegetation, the only habitat that's suitable for their needs is remaining along roadsides. So we can't just ignore the problem. We can't just focus our attention elsewhere. We have to figure out how to make roadsides a safe place for wildlife to live. So what are we going to do about this? We can hope that nature fights back, or that perhaps it gets smart enough to understand our road rules, like this deer here in Arizona, or we can turn to the field of road ecology. And at the risk of oversimplifying an entire scientific discipline, it goes a little bit like the video game Frogger. You have a limited number of lives, which is your wildlife population, and you have to move animals safely from one side of the road to the other so that they can access the food, mates, and other resources they might need. If too many get squashed by the purple race car or not enough cross the road at all, you lose too many lives and your population is gone extinct. Game is over. So road ecology helps us understand how wildlife respond to roads and how their response can guide our conservation actions. So we have the avoiders. They generally won't go near roads at all. They're put off by the surface, the smell, the lights, or the noise. like the grey-crowned babbler. We have the non-avoiders. They're a little bit ambivalent as to whether the road is there or not. They might thrive in roadside habitats or happily cross the road surface to get where they want to go. And then we have the road lovers, who are actually attracted to the roads or the road signs because that place offers them some kind of resource. So there might be roadkill for our scavengers or warm, sunny basking spots for our reptiles. And all of these animals differ in their roadkill risk. So for the road avoiders, as you can imagine, that's a generally low roadkill risk because it's pretty hard to get hit by a car if you're not going to go anywhere near the road. But these other two, these are the ones we need to worry about, particularly for animals that maybe aren't clever or smart and are fast enough to avoid our vehicles, or for roads that are really busy. So for species that are really slow moving or are prone to a freeze response, or for roads that have really, really high traffic volumes or high vehicle speeds, we start to get a really high risk of roadkill among the non-road avoiders and the road lovers. So if we move past the idea that maybe we should stop building roads through critical movement pathways in a wildlife habitat and think about the roads that we already have, what kind of tools do we have available to reduce the roadkill risk? And globally, a fair bit of creativity has gone into trying to solve this problem. So wildlife crossing structures and fencing are probably the most well-known. We also have fixed signs that sometimes unhelpfully say things like, there might be koalas for the next 376 kilometres, so pay attention. There are new initiatives like virtual fencing. This image up the top here is from a reindeer that's had its antlers painted in glow-in-the-dark or reflective paint so that cars will actually see them at night and not hit them. The image in the middle there is from a park in Brazil where they actually not just put up road signs to warn people of the wildlife risk, but they close those park roads at night to reduce the risk of roadkill. They paved them in bumpy cobbled stones to physically force cars to slow down, and they have lower speed limits at certain times of day, again, to coordinate with when different wildlife are using the road surface. So they've really gone all in to try and reduce the risk of roadkill in their national parks. My favourite one is the toad in the middle. So there are a lot of places in Europe and North America now where people will actually get really involved in helping out toads on their seasonal migration. So they'll get a bucket and a torch and they'll head out to the road at night and physically collect animals that are trying to cross roads and safely move them to the other side, which I think is just a pretty dedicated initiative. And all of these different types of things that we do can be broken down into two main groups. So we can use physical modifications. These are the wildlife crossing structures, the fencing, that keep the path of animals separate from the path for traffic. These are usually more expensive, relatively, and they can be tricky to retrofit to existing roads, although not impossible, depending on the context. Or we try and change the behaviour of either the animals or the drivers to get them to move in a different place, avoid the road entirely, or drive slower. And these tend to be way, way cheaper than building an entire land bridge, for example, and are often seen as much, much easier to implement. So they're really attractive to councils and road agencies in particular. So what do we know about how well all of these different types of road mitigation efforts work? And I'll give you a little bit of a spoiler before I dive into the detail, but so far, behavioural modifications don't perform as well as those physical modifications. It never seems to be as good as if we keep the path for wildlife separate from the path for traffic. And the simple fact is when you're depending on a behaviour change, if that behaviour change doesn't occur, then we still have that conflicting problem. So for example, road signs, we need people to slow down. And if they decide not to, then the road sign doesn't work anymore. So in 2016, some colleagues and I conducted what's called a meta-analysis. So we gathered all of the examples of where people had measured the success of different ways to reduce roadkill all across the world and tried to pull them together to get an overall picture of Are these things tending to be beneficial or tending to not make much of a difference? And some of the main findings from that were that fences reduce roadkill by 54% on average, which is really, really useful to know. And that includes, the examples of when fences maybe didn't work or when fences worked very, very well. But on average, they tended to reduce roadkill by about 54%. Wildlife crossing structures didn't have a big impact on roadkill unless there was also a fence present that both stopped animals from crossing the road where the crossing structures weren't present and helped funnel animals onto the crossing structure itself. We also know that most of the information that we have is from large mammals. And this is across the board for most of the ecological studies, unfortunately. We tend to have a really big focus on large mammals and know much, much less about small mammals and even less about birds, reptiles, amphibians, and don't even ask about invertebrates because there's hardly any research at all. When we focus on large mammals, where most of the data is, what we see is that fences actually were really, really effective. They had an 83% reduction in roadkill rates. Animal detection systems, so these are warning signs that are designed to tell when an animal is present in the nearby habitat and then flash towards the drivers to say there is actually a deer right about to cross the road in front of you, you need to slow down. They resulted in a 50% or 57% reduction in roadkill. And then they were compared to wildlife reflectors, which were a very common method of deterring wildlife from visiting roads in Europe in particular. Whenever the headlights flash onto the post, then the little mirror reflects that out into the neighbouring habitat, and the idea is it would frighten the animals away. They were really, really popular, but unfortunately had only a 1% reduction in roadkill. And what concerned us as researchers there was that these reflectors were really inexpensive, really easy to retrofit, widely implemented across Europe, but whenever they were independently assessed, they turned out to be ineffective. And that was usually attributed to the fact that animals after the first couple of months just got used to the fact that lights were shining in their eyes, realised that it wasn't associated with the threat and carried on moving anyway. So they developed an habituation, they got used to the idea. So I just wanted to pause to put in a brief defence of wildlife crossing structures, because I don't want you to walk away from this thinking that they're not useful. By themselves, they don't tend to prevent roadkill and mortality, but they do promote movement if they're in the right place and they're paired with specific and relevant fencing. And there's lots of amazing examples, both from Australia and all over the world, of wildlife using these structures, and many species depend on being able to cross roads. So we can't just fence them and prevent movement and then be done with it. But with that in mind, we conducted another big global review looking at all the literature evaluating how well wildlife crossing structures work. And so we know from all of these studies, in about 98% of cases, animals are using these structures to cross roads. But the other thing that we wanted to know was, do they actually change wildlife movement across roads? And so what I want you to think about when I show you the next graphs is this red line here. Any icon that appears above the line means the goal was met and the crossing structure was successful. Anything below the line means that that goal was not met. So the data that we pulled together show that wildlife crossing structures are pretty good at improving movement across roads when compared to doing nothing. All of these above the line up here show that there was an improvement in movement when crossing structures were in place compared to the road with no crossing structure at all. But when it comes to asking, can we use wildlife crossing structures to prevent a decline in movement, say when we're building a new road or making it wider, or can we put new crossing structures in to restore movement across roads, remove that barrier and take us back to a previous time point, the evidence is much, much weaker. So there are some examples of where we've prevented a decline in movement occurring, but mostly across these examples, the movement of animals across roads has declined even when we put that wildlife crossing structure in. So it is a case of if you build it, they will come, but it's not always enough to fully remove the barrier effect that roads have on wildlife. So there have been some recent advances in technology to reduce the roadkill impacts since that very first review was conducted. We have wildlife warning systems, and so what these have tried to do is go a step beyond the typical static signs that say look out for koalas until you reach Perth as you're driving along the Nullarbor. We know that those static signs are generally not effective because people get used to them and they don't change their behaviour by slowing down. So this new approach provides a more targeted warning. So it's either animal activated, so an animal with a tag might be nearby, or it might cross a sensor pad nearby, and that triggers the sign to suddenly light up and flash, telling drivers there is an animal very close by that's about to cross the road. You should slow down or prepare to stop. And those ones tend to work a lot better because they're very specific and drivers understand that the threat is real and not just a hypothetical animal. There are also some that are time activated. So at certain times of day when we know that wildlife are more active in an area, the signs are flashing to remind people this is a time where you should be slowing down. They're much like school zones. How well they work is still a bit variable. So they're much more common internationally. We know that they work better and people respond to them better than the static signs. The risk is that it does still rely on people changing their behaviour. So if people don't slow down and change their driving behaviour, it doesn't matter how many bells and whistles you have. So that's always a risk with that kind of option. The other big advance that I'll touch on briefly is virtual fencing. So the precursors of this were things like wildlife reflectors, so a post with a mirror essentially that shone headlights into the neighbouring habitat. There were also sound warnings that would frighten animals away from roads, and even smell deterrents. At one point they were trying to use wolf urine to deter animals from crossing roads in Europe. But mostly these have been shown to be ineffective, and that comes down to animals getting used to this warning and deciding that it's not relevant and proceeding to cross the road anyway. The other reason that we're interested in this is because installing long lengths of physical fencing is pretty hard to do. It's really expensive. They need to be maintained, and most people aren't looking at it as a feasible option. So these virtual fences are activated by headlights. They emit a sound or light or a combination of both. And the idea is that as cars are coming, a warning displays to the wildlife to frighten them away from the road, and it reduces the amount of roadkill. In terms of success, though, there have been very few scientific evaluations, and the results from those have been very mixed. So there are many, many trials. You'll see them all throughout the media at the moment with various shires and councils installing these as a trial. But what we've seen from the results of things that have monitored them, in the 5 studies that I've looked at, only one showed that the virtual fences reduced roadkill, and that one did actually end up in a scientific argument between people arguing about whether or not the methods used to evaluate that were correct. The other 4 studies all showed that virtual fences didn't actually make a difference to the wildlife in their area. And what that means is, firstly, that's not a lot of studies. That's only 5 times that it's been evaluated in scientific literature that's publicly available. And it means that it's not enough for us to understand the conditions under which virtual fences may or may not work. It could be that sometimes they work under certain conditions for certain species and sometimes they don't. But at the moment, we do not have enough information to understand what makes them work and when they are a good option, if at all. So I'm 100% supportive of these new technologies. Nobody wants them to work more than a road ecologist, I promise you. But these trials have to be paired with evaluation. If you're not measuring what you're doing, it's not actually a trial, it's just implementing an untested action. And that's something that I think we all really want to avoid, particularly when it comes to something as serious as preventing roadkill. So what actually makes a good trial when we're thinking about evaluating actions like this? Firstly, it's really important to measure roadkill, not simply the reported injuries that come into wildlife carers, for example. We really want to have a good measure of how many animals are being hit before and after. And that before-after comparison is really, really strong indicator that something's going on. But we also want to control for broader change. So this means having areas where you didn't take any action, comparing a virtual fence site to a site with no virtual fence. And a great example of why this is important comes from some of the virtual fence information that was done for wombats. They found that the amount of wombat roadkill declined after virtual fence was installed, which is great, right? And that's what all of the news articles reported. The problem with that is roadkill also declined at the location where no virtual fence was installed. So yes, technically, roadkill declined during the trial, but it didn't decline because of the trial. It might have just been that there were less animals moving through the landscape after the fences were installed. We also want to consider things like the fence end effect, which I'll walk through in a minute. And we definitely want our monitoring and evaluation to go beyond the potential period of habituation. We want it to outlast that effect of, are the animals just going to get used to it and then go back to their old behaviours in 6 months, 12 months, 2 years' time? So the fence end effect is this really good example of how we can get tripped up in our evaluations. And what I want you to do is imagine that we have this road and we've put the fence in the dotted lines on either side. And we want to find out whether or not this fence, virtual or otherwise, has worked. So we might hope to see something like this. We'll have our impact site where the fence is and our control site where no fence is. And as animals approach the road with the fence, they're deflected and move away. But animals that still try to cross the road where there's no fence end up turning into skull and crossbones. But what if our fence isn't long enough or it was the wrong kind of design? Animals that run into it might just follow it until they come to the unfenced area, try to cross the road anyway, and be killed. Or they run along and end up in our measured control site and are then killed in that area. Because what happens then is that we're actually not preventing roadkill from occurring, we're just shifting where it occurs. And if we shift it into our control site, we're actually making it look like the fence was even more effective than it was, when in fact it wasn't successful at all. That roadkill hasn't been reduced, it's just been relocated. So that's a really important and common trap to try and avoid when you're doing these kinds of evaluations. So some key messages before I finish up is that physical fencing we know does reduce roadkill, particularly if it's the correct design, if it's the right length, and if it's well maintained. And I'm very aware that all of these things are very expensive and difficult to do over long distances. Something that we can think about, I know that retrofitting large structures or fencing to roads can seem like a really daunting task, but a lot of examples in the literature have been when councils or road agencies have seized an opportunity from a culvert realignment or some other scheduled maintenance works and used that as an opportunity to make those roads a little bit more wildlife friendly in the process. So for example, adding more space under a creek crossing so that animals can actually pass under an existing creek line bridge rather than be faced with all of that rock riprap that's really difficult to cross. So those culvert upgrades can include some kind of modifications to make passage safer for wildlife. And yes, please try new technologies, but when you try, evaluate it and share those lessons with other people, because it's not cost effective if it doesn't work. I guess the reason I care so much about this is that it's too important to get wrong. And I think the only thing worse than not solving the wildlife roadkill problem would be thinking that we've solved it when we haven't, because then populations will still be driven to extinction, pun intended, and we haven't really done anything at all. Thank you very much for your time.